Today, we're embarking on a pretty crucial deep dive. We're looking at a collection of sources that make a provocative, and I have to say, a frankly alarming argument about one of the world's largest democracies.
hmm
We're going to be looking at material that argues India's really unique 75-year experiment in secular democracy is now facing, well, a structural and ideological reversal.
It's a huge claim.
It is. So the mission for this deep dive is to synthesize this really complex analysis about the changing relationship between the Indian state and religion. And the central argument here, it isn't just about a political shift. It's about a process these sources are calling de-secularisation.
Right.
And the potential for that process to be a direct pipeline, leading away from electoral democracy and, toward an authoritarian state.
And to ground that argument, which is a weighty one,
Yeah,
the sources draw some very stark historical parallels.
they do.
And international comparisons, too. They bring up the political trajectory of Pakistan, for example. The core idea is that religious ideology isn't just being used for votes anymore. It's actively being sort of weaponized to manipulate institutions and weaken that secular framework.
Okay, let's unpack this then. To really get our heads around this modern argument, we need a bit of a roadmap. We're going to start by looking way, way back to ancient political models.
The original blueprints.
Exactly. The blueprint for a state where, the priest effectively ruled the king. Then we'll shift to the incredible challenge that India's founders faced in creating a truly unique form of secularism.
Which was so different from the Western model.
Completely. And then finally, we'll dive right into the contemporary analysis, how, according to these sources, that original secular promise is being dismantled, well, right now.
Sounds good.
So this is where the historical analysis really starts to lay the groundwork. The sources begin by establishing a kind of historical model where the state and religion were basically a fused unit,
Operated as one.
usually under the direct influence of a religious authority who was, telling the king what to do. And the sources point to a very specific ancient Indian arrangement that serves as the foundation for this whole argument.
And that foundation is what they call the Kautilyan model. The analysis points to the state under Chandragupta Maurya as maybe the first non-secular monarchical empire in the world.
Wow.
And certainly in ancient India. This is where that dynamic was really institutionalized. You have Kautilya, a Brahmin, serving as the Hindu head priest, and then you have Chandragupta as the king.
Wait, let's drill down on that power structure for a second, because we're not just talking about a king who, respects his religious advisors.
No, it's much deeper than that.
The claim is that Kautilya's power was actually greater than the king's, that he held superior powers, superior emoluments, and that Chandragupta was essentially obligated to govern according to Kautilya's advice.
Precisely. That structural inequality is the absolute key here. The sources define this as the first Hindu theocratic monarchical state. And the theory for it comes from Kautilya's own work, the Arthashastra, written back in the 3rd century BC.
See, the Arthashastra is basically a manual for this.
The sources argue that, yes, it suggested a non-secular state mechanism whose purpose was, pretty explicitly, to sustain the Brahminic social order.
That is fascinating, and there's a point the analysis makes about the lineage of the king versus the priest, which is also really telling, isn't it?
It is. The sources note that while Chandragupta's own caste background isn't authentically known, he was identified as maybe being a Shudra. Kautilya's background as a Brahmin is established.
Right.
And that just underscores the point that the priestly class held the real ideological and structural power. It defined the state, really, regardless of the king's own status.
And what's wild is that the sources then draw this global echo. A very similar pattern, they say, emerged in Europe with the Catholic Holy See state.
Exactly. The Pope was seen as being analogous to Kautilya controlling every king in Europe, who were all expected to function under the Church's guidance.
And breaking that control is what so much of European history is about.
It is. That deep theological control was only really broken after the Protestant rebellion, Martin Luther. But the real structural shift, the sources argue, came later with Henry VIII of Britain. His revolt against Rome was a huge moment in subordinating the church to the state.
And the mechanism he used is so important for the argument. He established the institution of the archbishop.
Who was subordinated to the crown.
Yes.
Huh?
The sources stress that the archbishop, unlike the pope, could never direct state policy in Britain. That was a critical state-led move towards secular power.
And for a historical parallel in India, the analysis points back to King Ashok. Ashok's revolt against Brahmin priestly Hinduism, using his Buddhist vision, is compared directly to what Henry VIII did.
So he also asserted state dominance over the religious structure.
He did. He subordinated Buddhism to his suzerainty. It wasn't a full separation, not by a long shot, but it was a necessary step before that could even be imagined.
Okay, so having established that historical blueprint, let's pivot to the really extraordinary challenge that India's founders face. Britain, as we said, eventually evolved into a secular democratic state, but for a newly independent India, getting to secularism was far more complicated.
This is the core complexity of the Indian model. I mean, historically, Western nations largely became one-religion states after Christianity emerged.
Right.
So their task of separation, as difficult as it was mainly about separating the state from a single unified church.
But India was and is not a one-religion state. It's profoundly multi-religious, multi-caste. And you have all this historical baggage from, theocratic rule under previous Islamic rulers, and then the colonial legacy tied to Christianity.
That's why Indian secularism had to be structurally unique. It couldn't just manage the boundary between the state and faith. It had to address these deep-seated caste conflicts.
Which are all tied up with religion and social structure.
And, at the same time, interreligious conflicts. The thinkers who built the Indian Republic couldn't just copy the West. They had to, in a way, invent a new constitutional framework from the ground up.
And the sources really credit the key founders here, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, with engineering this secular democracy, with, of course, the moral strength of Mahatma Gandhi behind them.
Absolutely.
And it's emphasized that Ambedkar in particular was so acutely aware of the danger of establishing anything that looked like a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu state.
He was. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, the source argues that this whole push for a secular state was met with a lot of resistance.
From who?
From certain Brahminic pandits who basically just dismissed the whole concept as a Western or, a British imposition. The fact that India's democracy worked stably for 75 years was a testament to the will of the people, sure, but it was intellectually driven by thinkers who had studied world history.
People who were often educated in the West.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Which allowed them to move beyond what the analysis calls purely inward-looking knowledge in Sanskrit or Hindi.
That's a key distinction, that outward-looking versus inward-looking framework. It suggests the secular framework was a deliberate act of modern engineering.
A choice.
Okay, so now we have to dive into the contemporary argument. The sources claim those 75 years of stability are now being systematically eroded. They're giving way to de-secularization after the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or RSS, captured state power.
And for anyone who doesn't know, the RSS is this massive, incredibly influential Hindu nationalist volunteer organization. It provides the core ideological and organizational framework for the ruling party.
Right.
The analysis claims this whole process started consciously under the earlier Atal Bihari Vajpayee regime between 1999 and 2004. But it has intensified, dramatically since then. And this is where the source draws that direct, startling parallel back to Kautilya.
What's the specific parallel they draw?
The sources name the current RSS chief, Mohan Bhagwat, as a sort of Hindu head priest. And then, positioned alongside him, is Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's described as the elected modern Chandragupta. And crucially, they note his OBC tag, meaning he belongs to the other backward class.
That's a heavy comparison to make, but it seems to suggest that their relationship mirrors that old priest-king dynamic.
That's exactly the argument.
So what's the ideological engine that's supposedly powering this reversal?
Well, the core ideology is identified as the Kautilyan Manudharmic ideology. The analysis is referencing structures rooted in ancient, conservative, social and legal codes, like the Manusmriti, that are aimed at sustaining a very specific social order. The claim is this ideology is now being used to create deep, fundamentalist state institutions.
And the concrete impact is institutional. It's not just rhetoric.
Right.
The Indian education system, for example, is cited as being systematically brought under the grip of these ancient thinkers and Sanskrit religious texts. It's an ideological capture of the state's, intellectual infrastructure.
And there's a strange, almost paradoxical element here that the analysis points out.
Oh, what's that?
It's the irony that Prime Minister Modi, who has the OBC tag, he owes his right to an education, his ability to even participate in democracy, to the very modern and colonial-era structures that provided education to people who were previously excluded.
By the same social system he's now accused of reinforcing?
Exactly. Before the British systems, his ancestors would have likely been barred from getting a formal education.
Yet, despite that, the sources say de-secularization is happening with a vengeance. The argument is that separating religion and state required really sophisticated theory thinkers like Machiavelli, but desecularization is conceptually easier.
It's a return to a historical default.
So, if desecularization is the process, what's the destination? What does this all mean for the future of the Indian state?
The sources are, well, they're unequivocal on this point. The ultimate risk is that desecularization is simply the direct, unavoidable pathway that leads to de-democratization.
Okay, so how does that decay happen? What are the mechanisms of de-democratization that the analysis describes?
The first is the concentration of power. Power becomes concentrated in the hands of one person whose vision comes from religious, ideological mandates. People's rights get subordinated to the idea of religious duties.
And then what happens within the institutions?
That's the second mechanism. The institutional decay begins with systematically appointing people who adhere strictly to this one ideology. The analysis suggests the head of the RSS has effectively played the role of this central ideological commander for appointments for over a decade.
And if the ideological basis of the state shifts from reason to faith, then dissent has to be the primary casualty.
Exactly. Dissent is systematically killed because, as the source makes this really profound distinction, religion as an institution does not allow dissent. It is an institution of faith, not reason.
So if state structures move towards faith and obedience, the whole basis for democratic debate just gets eroded at its roots.
And that erosion, the analysis claims, is already extending into the electoral system itself. The sources claim that the entire election system, to start with, is being manipulated through religious ideology itself. And the stark prediction is that once these anti-secular forces consolidate power, their final goal will be to slowly move out of the election system itself.
To dismantle the democratic structure entirely.
Which leads to the most serious warning in the sources.
Which is the comparison to Pakistan.
Yes. The stark warning is that in this process of deep desecularization and de-democratization, India could see military dictators emerge. And they would use the same religious ideology to justify their rule, mirroring the trajectory we've seen in India's neighbor.
So the analysis concludes that India is currently a desecularized democracy, just sort of existing precariously.
Amidst non-secular dictatorships. And once that ideological shift is deep enough, it will enter a phase of deep de-democratization.
We've really charted the course here. From that Kautilyan blueprint to the unique challenge faced by Ambedkar and Nehru, and finally to this modern arrangement being called the modern Chandragupta system. The information here paints a very clear, if concerning, picture of the ideological forces at play.
And this all raises an important final question, one that the source itself focuses on. The analysis notes that mass protests against these kinds of ideological shifts have been seen globally.
Sure, even in places like America during moments of high political tension.
Exactly. Yet the sources suggest there is a distinct lack of widespread, sustained mass resistance in India.
And they attribute that lack of a unified response to one specific foundational factor.
That factor is described as India being a caste-divided society. The internal divisions, which the Founding Fathers tried so hard to mitigate with secular democracy, are now potentially preventing a unified political response to the dismantling of that very structure.
So what does this all mean for you to consider? If the source argues that democracy requires a culture built on reason, on dissent, and on rights, what happens when its institutions shift toward a basis of faith, duty, and obedience? And at the same time, the deep societal divisions that hamper organized dissent divisions like caste remain fundamentally unresolved. This is the core tension, really, that you're left to mull over.